Most people assume this story begins with men. It doesn't. Imagine you're standing beside a river about 15,000 years ago. A small group has just finished eating. Tomorrow, they'll move on, just as they've done their entire lives. They'll follow the animals north, gather fruit when it's in season, sleep wherever the land allows, and carry almost everything they own on their backs. If this camp disappears tomorrow, nature will erase almost every trace that these people were ever here. Now ask yourself a simple question. If nobody owns anything, why would anyone care who inherits it? For almost all of human history, they didn't. That's one of the biggest misconceptions about our ancestors. We often imagine that men have always ruled women, that fathers have always controlled families, and that society has always been organized around male power. But the archaeological evidence paints a much more complicated picture. Hunter-gatherer societies weren't perfect. Men and women usually had different responsibilities, and violence certainly existed. But many anthropologists believe those differences rarely translated into the rigid hierarchies that appeared much later. The reason is surprisingly simple. Survival depended on both. A successful hunt could feed the group for days. But studies of modern hunter-gatherers have shown that gathered foods, plants, nuts, fruits, roots, shellfish, often provided a huge share of the calories people actually consumed. In some environments, gathering was the more reliable source of food. That meant neither sex could easily dominate the other. A hunter needed gatherers. Gatherers needed hunters. Children needed everyone. Power wasn't concentrated, it was distributed, which makes what happened next even stranger. Because sometime after the last ice age, humanity made a decision that looked completely harmless. Instead of following food, we decided to grow it. At first, farming must have felt like a miracle. Imagine harvesting more grain than your family could eat. Imagine storing food through the winter, instead of hoping the next hunt succeeds. Imagine never having to wander hundreds of kilometers again. For the first time in history, people began staying in one place. Villages appeared, then larger villages, then towns. Everything seemed to be getting better. But hidden inside that miracle was a problem no human society had ever faced before. When you spend 30 years clearing land, planting crops, digging irrigation channels, building fences, and raising livestock, what happens to all of it when you die? That question barely existed before agriculture. You can't really inherit a forest. You can't inherit a migrating herd of wild animals. You certainly can't inherit land you abandoned every few weeks. But you can inherit a farm. You can inherit sheep. You can inherit grain. You can inherit wealth. And suddenly, the future mattered in a completely different way. Because once wealth exists, someone has to receive it. Every society that had ever existed before farming had solved the same problem in roughly the same way. If food was scarce, you shared it. If someone got sick, the group looked after them. Children weren't raised by two people alone. Anthropologists sometimes call humans cooperative breeders. It's one of the reasons our species succeeded where so many others failed. But farms slowly changed that way of thinking. A farmer couldn't simply pack up and leave. His wealth stayed exactly where he'd built it. For the first time in history, success could be accumulated, and that's when a completely new problem appeared. One question suddenly matters more than anything else. Who inherits all of this? Because your life's work depends on the answer. Hunter-gatherers almost never had to ask that question. Farmers couldn't stop asking it. And once inheritance becomes important, so does paternity. Because maternity is obvious. A mother gives birth. Everyone sees it happen. Fatherhood is different. There was only one way to become reasonably confident that your children were actually yours. You controlled female sexuality. Not necessarily because men suddenly became more jealous. Jealousy had existed for hundreds of thousands of years. Not because love suddenly appeared. Humans had been falling in love long before the first wheat field. The difference was that those emotions now had economic consequences. If your land passed to someone else's child, your family lost everything. One invention had quietly linked three ideas together for the first time: property, inheritance, paternity. And once those three became connected, entire societies began reorganizing themselves around protecting them. Marriage became more formal. Virginity became socially valuable. Adultery became more severely punished. Family names increasingly followed the father's line. Property moved from father to son. What had once been personal relationships slowly became legal institutions. And the more wealth societies accumulated, the more those institutions hardened. Notice something strange. None of this required anyone to wake up one morning and declare, "From today onward, men will control women." History almost never works like that. Nobody invented patriarchy in a single generation. It emerged gradually over thousands of years, as millions of ordinary people adapted to an entirely new way of living. The farmer wanted to protect his fields. His son wanted to inherit them. The village created rules. The next generation accepted those rules as normal. A few centuries later, nobody remembered a world before them. That's often how history changes, until one day they're simply called tradition.